He always walked slowly, almost as if the world around him moved faster than he could keep up. In classrooms, hallways, and even at events, people rarely noticed him. He never pushed himself to the front, never spoke loud enough to interrupt, never tried to get attention. It was like he had built an invisible shield, not from fear, but from a quiet understanding that life didn't need him to be loud. He moved through crowds, yet the crowds seemed to move around him, ignoring him, assuming he had nothing to offer. At school, he was the type of person teachers barely remembered unless they had to call on him. In class, he sat near the back, taking notes carefully, answering only when necessary. Other students whispered about sports, achievements, or loud personalities, but he didn't join those conversations. They assumed he didn't care. He assumed it wasn't worth the energy. Sometimes he would raise his hand, but only for questions he really needed answered. No one noticed the way his eyes lit up when someone explained something in a way he hadn't thought of before. No one noticed the way he listened, really listened, when people talked about their dreams or problems. He seemed invisible, but he saw everything at lunch. He usually sat alone, or with one or two others who also didn't fit in anywhere else. It wasn't a sad choice. It was more comfortable that way, he observed. He watched how people laughed and joked, how some were cruel without realizing it, how others pretended to be confident while inside they were scared. And he listened. Oh, how he listened. He had an incredible memory for voices, for tones, for small changes in the way someone spoke. It was something he never spoke about, something people never guessed about him. Most of the time, people thought he was quiet because he had nothing to say. But the truth was far from it. People underestimated him everywhere. In competitions at school, when teams were picked, he was the last to be chosen or sometimes not at all. People assumed he wasn't good at anything. He wasn't strong, athletic, or loud. He didn't have a flashy personality or a strong presence that demanded attention. People judged him by what they could see on the surface. They didn't see the hours he spent practicing, the times he stayed up late learning something new, the countless hours he had spent alone, perfecting skills no one ever knew he had. When it came to music, people didn't pay much attention to him either. There was a small piano in the corner of his home, old and slightly out of tune, and he would sit there for hours after school. No one thought much of it. His family sometimes peeked in and smiled at his quiet dedication, but neighbors, friends, or classmates never came by to listen. He never performed for anyone outside his home, except maybe at family gatherings where adults politely clapped, even if they didn't fully understand. Still, he kept going, touching each key as if he were speaking directly to the world he hadn't been allowed to join. Music was his language, his secret place, the part of him no one saw. Even at home, his quiet nature made him hard to notice. His parents were busy, working long hours to make ends meet. His younger sibling ran around, full of energy and noise, drawing attention easily. And he stayed in the background, helping quietly, observing, learning. When dinner was on the table, he would set things down without drawing attention, never asking for praise. And when someone asked about his day, he would give a short answer. It was fine, he would say. They didn't push because it seemed normal to them. They didn't know that in that quiet day he had discovered a new song, or learned a new technique on the piano, or noticed a new way to understand people. Sometimes, he would leave school and walk down the streets. Headphones on, not always to listen to music, but to block out the chatter of people who never really saw him. He would watch faces, watch gestures, the way people spoke without knowing someone was watching. Sometimes he would smile at small acts of kindness. Sometimes he would frown at moments of cruelty or carelessness. The world moved fast, but he noticed the details. It was like he was learning something invisible, preparing for something that no one else imagined. Even though no one expected much from him, he had dreams. Quiet dreams, not the loud kind that everyone could see. Dreams that lived in his mind, tucked away, waiting for the right moment. He dreamed of performing, of standing in front of people and letting them hear something only he could give. He dreamed of showing the world that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, sometimes carry the loudest truths. But for now, those dreams stayed hidden. He couldn't risk being laughed at, being dismissed, being underestimated further. Not yet in class. During group work, he was often ignored. People would talk over him, dismiss his suggestions, assume someone louder or more confident had a better idea. And sometimes he would stay silent, letting them have their moment. But other times, he would speak just once, just enough to plant an idea, a seed that people would take and grow. Not realizing it had come from him, that was the way he navigated the world, quiet, careful, unnoticed. Yet each small word, each small act, carried a weight people never guessed. He had a few friends who understood him in small ways. Not many, but enough to keep him connected. They didn't care about popularity or attention. They cared about listening, about sharing ideas, about enjoying small moments. They would sit with him in silence sometimes, each reading a book or sketching in a notebook. In those moments, there was no judgment, no expectation, no laughter at his quiet nature. Just acceptance, just understanding. And that was enough. People underestimated him, but he didn't mind. At least, he told himself he didn't. Sometimes he felt the sting of a joke or a dismissive comment. Sometimes he wondered why no one ever looked at him differently. But mostly, he focused on what mattered to him. Music, observation, understanding the world around him, and waiting. Waiting for a moment when his quiet life would become something extraordinary. Even teachers who were strict or impatient noticed him sometimes, but they often assumed he needed guidance or pushing. They didn't realize he was already pushing himself every day in ways invisible to them. They didn't see the hours he spent learning, practicing, dreaming, imagining. They judged him by the moments they could see, but the important moments were hidden, private, and deep. That was his choice. The world might not have been ready for him yet, but he was ready for the world. And so, he moved through life quietly. Unnoticed, underestimated, yet aware of everything. He smiled at small kindnesses, ignored small cruelties, learned from small opportunities. He practiced music in secret, observed people in public, and carried a sense of patience that few understood. He knew one day the world would listen. He didn't know how, or when, or where, but he believed it. And sometimes, belief is all a person needs to begin something remarkable. No one expected much from him. They thought he was shy, quiet, unremarkable. They didn't know that in those quiet moments, he was growing stronger, building something invisible but powerful, something that would one day break through every expectation. And he waited patiently, calmly, knowing that the world often laughs at the quiet ones until the quiet ones decide it's their turn to be heard. He had always known that people underestimated him, but he never thought it would feel quite like this. The school was holding a talent showcase, something small yet important. Students were encouraged to sign up, show their skills, and maybe even get noticed by teachers or peers. For most, it was exciting, an opportunity to shine. For him, it was terrifying. He had always played piano at home, always sung quietly when no one else was listening. But the thought of standing in front of a crowd made his chest tighten. His friends, the ones who understood him without needing words, encouraged him. "You should do it," one of them said quietly one afternoon. "They need to hear what you can do." He nodded, feeling the familiar pull of both hope and fear. Hope that maybe this was the moment he could finally show the world what he had been practicing all these years. Fear that it would all fall apart, that people would laugh or turn away, that all the years of quiet work would vanish in a single mistake. When he arrived to sign up, he noticed the looks. Some students smirked when they saw his name on the sheet. Others whispered behind their hands. One of them even leaned over to their friend and said something that made both of them laugh. He didn't hear the exact words clearly, but he heard the laughter. It wasn't cruel, not exactly, but it carried a kind of disbelief, a clear, "we don't think this will matter" feeling. And yet, he continued filling in his name, writing piano and vocals, trying to ignore the stares and murmurs. Back at home, he practiced more than ever. His fingers ran over the piano keys, not carelessly, not just to play a song, but to tell a story. Each note carried years of quiet observation. Every rise and fall of a melody reflecting moments he had experienced, but never spoken about. He could feel the music in his chest, moving through him, begging to be shared. Yet every time he imagined the audience, he could feel their doubt pressing down, their invisible gaze judging him before he even started. The days leading up to the showcase were the hardest. Every time someone asked what he was doing, he would shrug, muttering, just practicing. People were curious, of course, and the more curious they were, the more they assumed it would be something small, unimpressive, or funny. He began to hear whispers in the hallways, casual coming, tease about who might win, who might fail, and how this person him wouldn't even make it to the end. The night before the showcase, he stayed up late. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed every sound to feel sharper. He sat at the piano, looking at the keys, wondering if he could do it. Could he stand there tomorrow and let them hear? Could he survive their eyes, their murmurs, their laughter if it came? He remembered every moment he had been overlooked, every time people dismissed him, every second he had been told he didn't matter. And for the first time, instead of feeling small, he felt something else. Anger. Not the loud, shouting kind of anger, but the quiet, determined kind. The kind that makes you refuse to stay invisible. The kind that makes you want to prove to yourself that the years of preparation, the hours of practice, the patience of being unseen were not wasted. He realized that this wasn't about them, the ones who underestimated him. This was about him, about finally letting the part of him that had always been silent have a voice. Morning came too fast. He walked to the school, backpack heavy with sheet music and his practice notebook. His heart thumped in a rhythm that matched his nerves. He noticed the other students arriving full of confidence, chattering loudly, showing off outfits, checking each other's appearances. He felt out of place, as he always did, but today he had a reason to stand out. Even if they didn't realize it yet, as he waited backstage, he heard the audience laughing at small jokes, whispering to friends, teasing each other. Some even glanced toward the stage, sizing up the competition. When someone mentioned his name, he could hear a faint chuckle. It was the sound of disbelief, and he understood that sound better than anyone. He had lived in it for years. People had always assumed he couldn't do anything remarkable, and now, here it was again. In the faces of people who would never have guessed, he had been preparing for this moment for years. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the lessons he had learned quietly. He remembered patience, listening, observing, and practicing when no one was looking. He remembered the joy of music in his room, the satisfaction of learning something new, the way a melody could express what words never could. And then he breathed, slowly, trying to calm the storm of fear and anticipation inside him. When it was almost his turn, a few students came over to tease him, joking that he should just sit down and let someone else perform. He felt the old familiar sting, the doubt creeping in. But instead of shrinking, he felt a strange calm. He realized that their laughter didn't define him. Their disbelief didn't matter. He had something no one could take away, something they could not see, but would hear in a few moments. And that knowledge gave him courage he didn't know he had. Finally, the moment came. His name was called, and he stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, almost blinding, and the audience seemed larger than life. He heard some murmurs, some quiet snickers, but he focused on the piano in front of him. The keys were familiar, comforting, and waiting for his hands. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. Every sound from outside the stage faded away. It was just him, the piano, and the music that had been inside him all these years. He started with a soft note, almost hesitant. The room quieted, people leaning forward without realizing it. The first few notes were delicate, careful, as if testing the water, and then he let go. The music grew stronger, more confident. His fingers danced across the keys, following the melody that had been living in him for years. He sang softly at first, letting his voice blend with the piano. It was smooth, warm, and unexpected. People in the audience straightened in their seats, some exchanging surprised looks. Some students who had laughed at him earlier leaned forward, uncertain now. Their whispers stopped. The teachers in the front row glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. The quiet boy they had all underestimated was creating something that demanded attention. Each note was clear, precise, and full of feeling. Every rise and fall of his voice carried a story, a piece of him that no one had ever seen. The people who had doubted him felt it too. Though they didn't know exactly what it was, as he played, he remembered all the times he had been ignored, all the moments people had laughed or whispered, all the times he had been told he wasn't good enough. And he let those memories fuel him, turning every bit of doubt into power, every moment of invisibility into a reason to shine. The music wasn't just about talent anymore. It was about proving, quietly but unmistakably, that he existed, that he mattered, that he could not be overlooked any longer. By the end of the song, the room was silent, stunned. Not a single clap, not a single whisper for a few seconds. People didn't know how to react. The quiet boy they had assumed would fail had delivered something extraordinary. And in that silence, he felt a small thrill of triumph. He had faced doubt, laughter, and underestimation. And he had not just survived it, he had created something beautiful. When the applause finally came, it was overwhelming. People who had doubted him stood, clapping, some with wide eyes, some shaking their heads in disbelief. He smiled quietly, a small, modest smile, knowing that this was just the beginning. The laughter and whispers might return in the future, but they would not take away this moment. He had faced the judgment of others, the sting of doubt, and had turned it into something that could not be ignored. After stepping off the stage, his friends came to congratulate him. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. The pride in their eyes, the shared understanding, was enough. He felt lighter, freer, as if a burden he had carried for years had been lifted. He had taken the first step in showing the world who he really was, and it felt incredible. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more times when people assumed he couldn't do it. But he also knew something stronger now. He knew that when he let his talent and his voice shine, even in the face of disbelief, he could change the way people saw him. And more importantly, he could change the way he saw himself. That day, he walked home with a new sense of confidence. He didn't shout it from the rooftops, didn't demand attention, didn't let it turn into arrogance. It was quiet, steady, the kind of strength that comes from finally knowing your own value. The people who underestimated him had seen only a glimpse, but he had seen himself fully for the first time. And that was more important than anything else. He spent the evening replaying the music in his mind, imagining the notes filling the room again, imagining the surprised faces, the silent awe. He realized that this feeling, this quiet triumph, was something he could carry into every part of his life. It didn't matter what anyone else expected. What mattered was that he had faced the fear, faced the doubt, and had done something remarkable. And for the first time, he knew that underestimation was no longer a chain, it was a challenge. A spark that could ignite something extraordinary. The days after the showcase were strange. People who had laughed or doubted him now gave quiet nods, brief smiles, and occasional compliments. Some of them even asked him to play again, not realizing how much they had underestimated him before. The feeling was new, almost confusing. He had spent so long being invisible that any attention felt foreign. But instead of being proud in the usual way, he felt something deeper, a sense that he was beginning to claim a part of the world that had always ignored him at school. Teachers who had never noticed him began asking him questions about music. "Do you play often?" they would ask. "Have you learned other pieces?" And for the first time, he answered fully, telling them about the songs he loved, hours he had spent practicing, and the small victories that no one had ever seen. Some of them listened with genuine interest, nodding and encouraging him. He smiled quietly, feeling a warmth he had rarely experienced before. Recognition wasn't everything, but it mattered in its own subtle way. Even his classmates, the ones who had doubted him, began to watch him differently. Some were still hesitant, unsure if it was luck or true talent. Others openly admitted they had misjudged him. It was a strange feeling to be noticed, especially by people who had once dismissed him. He realized that underestimation often comes from not knowing someone deeply. It's from judging based on appearances instead of effort. And now he was starting to see how powerful it could be to prove them wrong, not for revenge, not for applause, but to finally be seen as he truly was. He returned to his piano at home every evening, more dedicated than ever. But now he approached his practice differently. It wasn't just about repetition or learning notes anymore. It was about feeling the music, living inside it, letting it reflect his experiences, his thoughts, and even the doubts he had faced. Every chord became a word, every melody a sentence, telling stories that had never been told. He began experimenting with his voice, letting it stretch and rise, feeling the emotion behind every note. It was no longer practice. It was expression, a language that had been waiting for him all along. Word of his performance began to spread beyond school. Some teachers mentioned it to other schools. Some students told their families. Slowly, people started to ask him to perform for small gatherings, local events, or even casual meetings where someone needed music. Each time he felt the familiar rush of nerves, but now it was mixed with excitement. The world was giving him opportunities he had never imagined, and with every opportunity, his confidence grew. He realized that he had been underestimated for so long, not because he wasn't capable, but because people had never seen what he could do. One afternoon, a small community event invited him to play. It was nothing huge, just a few dozen people sitting in chairs in a local hall. But he treated it like the most important stage in the world. He arrived early, setting up carefully, checking the piano, and imagining the music flowing through the room. When people started to arrive, some of them glanced at him skeptically. They had heard he could play, but they didn't know what to expect. The whispers and small laughs returned. He felt the familiar pressure of doubt pressing down, but this time he didn't let it control him. He had learned to carry it, to let it sharpen his focus instead of weakening it. When it was his turn, he stepped forward and sat at the piano. The lights weren't bright, but the room seemed larger than life. People shuffled in their seats, some checking phones, some whispering to neighbors. He took a deep breath, remembering all the times he had been overlooked, all the moments people assumed he couldn't perform, and he let that memory flow into his fingers. The first note rang clear and confident, filling the room instantly. The soft, steady sound captured attention. Conversation stopped. People looked up, noticing for the first time that something remarkable was about to happen. He began to play a song he had composed himself, peaceful of emotion, twists, and subtle surprises. The melody rose and fell like waves, carrying the energy of someone who had been silent for too long. He sang along, his voice blending with the piano in a way that seemed natural yet completely unexpected. People in the audience leaned forward, mesmerized by the depth and control in his voice. It wasn't just skill they were hearing, it was feeling. A story told without words, yet understood perfectly. Some of the students who had once mocked him stared with wide eyes. Teachers whispered to each other, astonished at the range and emotion he conveyed. Parents in the audience exchanged looks of surprise, realizing that this quiet, unassuming boy could create something so moving. Every note, every pause, every rise of his voice demanded attention. And for the first time, people understood that the years of being underestimated had only made him stronger, more focused, and more expressive. Midway through the song, something remarkable happened. He closed his eyes and let go completely, losing himself in the music. It was as if every fear, every moment of doubt, every time he had been overlooked, all came together in a single, perfect expression. The room seemed to hold its breath, caught in a wave of emotion they hadn't expected. Some people's eyes filled with tears. Others simply sat frozen, unable to look away. The quiet boy they had dismissed had transformed the space into something unforgettable. When the final note lingered in the air, there was a pause, heavy and profound. No one moved, no one spoke. The sound hung in the room, leaving an echo of awe and disbelief. Then, slowly, the applause began. At first it was tentative, unsure. Then it grew louder, stronger, unstoppable. People stood, clapping, cheering, some even shouting words of admiration. And through it all, he sat at the piano, smiling quietly. Not out of arrogance, but because he had done what he had set out to do. He had shown them, without saying a word, who he truly was. Afterward, people came forward to talk to him, to compliment him, to ask how he had learned to do such things. He answered politely, humbly, though inside he felt a quiet pride he had never known before. For years, people had assumed he couldn't do anything remarkable. Now they knew better. But more importantly, he knew better. He had carried a talent in silence, nurtured it, and let it speak when the moment was right. And in that moment, it had shattered all expectations. He walked home slowly that evening, the applause still ringing in his ears. The streets felt quieter, the world more open, and for the first time, he felt fully seen. Not just noticed, but truly seen for who he was. It wasn't about fame or recognition or proving anyone wrong. It was about finally acknowledging himself, his dedication, his patience, his talent. All the years of quiet work, all the times he had been overlooked, had led to this, and it felt like a beginning, not an end. Over the next few weeks, more invitations came. Local events, small gatherings, even school functions wanted him to perform. Each time, the initial nerves returned, but they were now accompanied by a growing excitement. He had tasted the feeling of being heard, truly heard, and he wanted more. He experimented with new songs, new melodies, and new ways to express himself. Each performance became stronger, more confident, and more moving. People who had once underestimated him now paid attention from the very beginning. The change was not just in their perception, but in his own self-belief. He also began noticing subtle changes in himself. He walked taller, spoke more clearly, and even in quiet moments he carried a sense of purpose. The world could doubt him, laugh at him, or underestimate him. But now he knew that none of that could diminish what he carried inside. The music, his voice, and his quiet determination were unstoppable when he allowed them to flow freely. And he began to realize that underestimation could be a gift, a spark to ignite something truly extraordinary. One evening, after playing a new composition, he sat back and closed his eyes. He thought of all the times he had been ignored, all the moments of doubt, all the whispers and small laughs, and he realized something. Those moments had made him who he was. They had built patience, resilience, focus, and creativity. They had created a deep, unshakable understanding of himself and his craft. And now, for the first time, he could stand in front of an audience and share it. Not in words, but in the language that had always been his own. People started to recognize him outside performances too. Some students nodded politely in the hallways. Teachers smiled knowingly. And even strangers on the street mentioned they had heard about his music. He didn't seek attention. It found him. And when it did, he accepted it quietly, graciously, understanding that the recognition was not the goal. The goal had always been to let his voice be heard, to prove to himself that his talent could not be contained by the judgments of others, and in the quiet moments. When he returned home and sat at his piano alone, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The music was still his refuge, still his secret world, but now it had a bridge to the outside world. The same people who had underestimated him, laughed at him, and ignored him had glimpsed the truth. They had seen for the first time the depth and power he carried, and he knew, quietly but firmly, that this was just the beginning of something much larger than any single performance. The more he performed, the more people began to realize that his talent was not a one-time thing. Each performance was different, each note carried emotion, and each melody seemed to tell a story that no one else could tell. Those who had doubted him at first were now watching, leaning forward, eager to hear what he would do next. And yet, even with the growing recognition, he remained calm, focused, and humble. He knew that talent alone was not enough. It was the connection, the feeling, and the courage to face the audience that truly mattered. At school, the whispers had changed. No longer were they small laughs or jokes at his expense. Now, they were filled with curiosity and admiration. Students who once ignored him now asked questions, not about his abilities, but about how he felt when he played, how he learned so quickly, and how he could make music sound so alive. He answered simply, never boasting, always honest. "I just play what I feel," he would say. "I listen, and then I let the music speak." His words were quiet, But they carried truth, and people began to understand that there was more to him than anyone had realized. The day came when a larger event was organized, a gathering for local artists and performers. People from neighboring towns attended, teachers, families, and music enthusiasts. He was nervous, of course, but the nerves were different now. They were no longer a warning of potential failure. Instead, they were a reminder of what mattered: honesty, passion, and courage. When his name was called, the audience was larger, the room brighter, and the expectations higher. Some faces in the crowd carried doubt, some carried curiosity, and some carried memory, remembering the quiet boy who had surprised them before. He stepped onto the stage, his fingers brushing the keys, feeling the familiar comfort of the piano. The audience was silent, waiting. Some of them whispered among themselves, wondering if he would deliver again. Others stared, eager to see if the boy they had underestimated could truly capture the room a second time. He took a deep breath, letting it settle into his chest, steadying himself. Then he began. The first notes were soft, gentle, but purposeful. They spread across the room, drawing attention naturally. His voice followed, smooth and clear, blending seamlessly with the piano. But this time, he added a new depth, subtle intensity that carried the experience of everything he had lived through. The years of silence, the moments of doubt, the times people laughed or overlooked him. Each note was deliberate, each chord a statement. People who had come with casual curiosity now sat upright, fully engaged. Halfway through the song, something changed. His music began to swell, rising in power and emotion. The audience felt it without realizing why. It was not just skill, it was honesty, and there is no way to ignore honesty. Some people held their breath, captivated. Others could not move, frozen by the intensity and beauty of the sound. Those who had doubted him before now realized the depth of what they had been missing. It was as if the quiet boy on stage had opened a window into a world they had never seen, a world filled with heart, passion, and truth. When he looked up for a moment, he saw faces full of shock. Teachers whispered to each other, astonished. Parents covered their mouths, unable to hide their amazement. Students who had mocked or ignored him could not believe what they were witnessing. The music, the voice, and the emotion all combined to create something larger than any single person. It was bigger than expectation, bigger than doubt, bigger than underestimation. For a few moments, the audience forgot everything else, and all that existed was the sound, the story, and the boy who had been underestimated for so long. The room was so quiet that he could hear every breath, every small movement, every subtle response, and he knew instinctively that this was the moment people would remember. This was the moment where underestimation collided with truth, and truth came out victorious. His music carried confidence now, but not arrogance. It carried power, but not aggression. It carried honesty, and that honesty left no room for doubt. Every note, every word, every rise and fall of the melody was a declaration: I exist. I have talent. I will not be ignored. When the final note lingered, the room stayed silent, heavy with awe. No one spoke. No one moved. Some held their hands over their hearts. Some blinked rapidly, trying to process what they had just experienced. Then slowly, gradually, the applause began. It started as tentative claps, unsure but impressed. Then it grew, spreading across the room, stronger and louder, unstoppable. People stood, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. Those who had doubted him before were no longer laughing. They were speechless. Filled with respect and admiration, he stood quietly, smiling modestly, knowing that this was more than a performance. It was a message, a proof, a shift in perception. The same people who had underestimated him, laughed at him, or ignored him could no longer do so. He had shown them what quiet determination, patience, and talent could achieve. But even more important than their recognition was his own. He had faced the pressure, the skepticism, and the doubt, and had come through stronger, more confident, and fully himself. After the applause, people came forward to speak with him. Some offered compliments, Some asked questions about his training, and some simply shook their heads in disbelief. He responded quietly, humbly, but his eyes reflected the satisfaction of someone who had worked tirelessly for this moment. For years he had prepared, observed, practiced, and waited. And now the wait had paid off. The audience had seen not just skill, but the story behind the music. And that story was impossible to ignore. The news of this performance spread even further. Teachers spoke about it in staff meetings. Students told friends from other schools. Families talked about it at gatherings. Even people who had never met him began to hear whispers of his talent. And each time, he continued to practice, to refine his music, to explore new melodies and emotions. Recognition was growing, but he did not let it change his focus. The music was still his center, his expression, his way of communicating the things words could not. He began to notice small changes in his daily life, too. Students who had once ignored him now nodded politely, smiled when he passed, or asked small questions about music. Teachers paid closer attention, offering guidance and encouragement. Even strangers began to approach him, curious about his story, about his talent, about the quiet boy who had captured a room with nothing but music and voice. And in all of this, he remained calm, steady, grounded. He had learned that true recognition comes from consistency, honesty, and courage. Not just from a single performance. At home, he returned to the piano with renewed energy. Each session was not just practice, but exploration. He experimented with new styles, new melodies, and even new ways of singing. His voice had gained power and control, and his fingers moved with confidence and precision. But more than that, he had gained something far more important: belief in himself. The years of underestimation, laughter, and doubt had built him, shaped him, and prepared him for this moment. And now, he knew, nothing could take that away. Even when he walked through the hallways, he felt different. There was no arrogance, no desire to show off, but there was quiet strength, a steady presence that came from knowing one's own worth. People noticed it. They could see that he was different, not because of loud gestures or flashy behavior, but because he had faced the world, faced doubt, and emerged not only unbroken, but stronger, more confident, and fully aware of his talent. One evening, after a particularly moving performance at a local gathering, he sat quietly at the piano. He closed his eyes, replaying the moments of the audience's reactions, the silent awe, the growing respect. He realized something profound: all the underestimation, all the laughter, all the quiet moments of invisibility had been preparation. They had created resilience, patience, and the ability to communicate without words. They had taught him the power of waiting, of observing, and of letting talent speak when the moment was right, and he understood now that this was only the beginning. There would be more performances, bigger audiences, and more people who had never heard his voice before. But he also knew that each time, he would carry the lessons of patience, humility, and quiet strength with him. The applause, the recognition, the shock in people's eyes, it was all temporary. What mattered was the music, the truth he expressed, and the confidence he had gained in himself. He smiled softly, knowing that the world had begun to see him for who he truly was. Not just a quiet boy, not just someone underestimated, but a person capable of touching hearts, moving emotions, and shattering expectations. And in that quiet moment, sitting at the piano, he felt a sense of peace and purpose that he had never known before. He was no longer invisible. He had been heard, and the world would never underestimate him again. The days after his last performance felt different. People began to notice him wherever he went, not just as the quiet boy in the corner, but as someone with a talent that demanded attention. Teachers asked him about music more often. Students sought advice, and strangers spoke to him about how deeply his performances had moved them. At first, it was strange. He was not used to being the focus. But slowly, he began to understand that being recognized was not a burden, it was a reflection of years of work, patience, and determination. He continued practicing every day. The piano in his room became more than just an instrument. It was a partner, a companion that carried his emotions, his dreams, and his experiences. Each melody he created now had a deeper layer, infused with everything he had learned from being underestimated. He experimented with songs that were challenging, complex, and full of emotion. He pushed his voice in ways he had never dared before, and as he did, he felt something growing inside him, confidence not based on applause or recognition, but on the simple knowledge that he had worked, struggled, and improved. School felt different too. The hallways, once filled with whispers and laughter at his expense, now carried nods of respect and curiosity. Students would glance at him with interest, sometimes quietly complimenting him on his latest performance. Teachers smiled knowingly, recognizing the patience and dedication it had taken for someone so quiet to reach this level. And even the parents who had once smiled politely at his small family performances now asked him questions. Wanting to understand how he had developed such talent, he answered calmly, never boasting, always sharing what he had learned with honesty. One afternoon, a local talent show invited him to perform again. This time, the stage was bigger, the lights brighter, and the audience larger than anything he had faced before. As he waited backstage, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He remembered the first time he had performed in front of people who doubted him. He remembered the laughter, the underestimation, the whispers. And now, he thought, it was different. This was no longer just about proving others wrong. It was about sharing what he had carried for so long, letting his music speak for itself when his name was called. He walked onto the stage with quiet confidence. The audience fell silent immediately, sensing something special was about to happen. He sat at the piano, letting his fingers rest lightly on the keys for a moment. The first note rang out, pure and steady, filling the room with sound. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but soon it grew stronger, bolder, as he let the music flow naturally. His voice followed, smooth, warm, and full of emotion. The audience leaned forward, caught in the depth and honesty of what they were hearing as he played, felt a connection unlike any before. The room was filled with people who had come for different reasons, curiosity, support, or even casual entertainment, but now all of them were listening, captivated by the music and the story behind it. Every note carried a memory, every chord expressed an emotion, and every rise and fall of his voice told a story of patience,